Welcome back to another episode of Work in Programming. My name is Matthew Weeks, and this week I am joined by Charity Majors, the CTO of Honeycomb, and ex-Facebook engineering manager, and one of the original engineers from Parse. Charity, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I guess normally I ask people to give a quick little introduction about what they do or how they perceive themselves. I don't know if you...
Sure. I think of myself as an ops geek. I've been on call since I was 17, back in the days when they actually called them sysadmins, right? I had root at my university. I don't think they do that anymore.
Yeah, probably not.
But I never really was one of those kids who was like, I'm going to be a founder, because I kind of loathe the founder industrial complex and just like the Silicon Valley worship of, people who start companies are not actually better than other people. But yeah. I was kind of, after Facebook, I was trying to figure out what to do next. And, I had a pedigree coming out of Facebook. I've never had a pedigree before in my life, right? And so people were like, would you like some money? And I was like, well, actually, there is something that I think needs to be built. Fully believed that we would fail. I was just like, we're totally going to fail, but this would be a fun way to spend a year or two just writing a lot of Go code, right? But we keep not failing, so here we are.
I like that approach to it. How did you I'm sure it's something that you dealt with on the job, but how did you come up with the concept for Honeycomb?
Oh, well, it came from our struggles at Parse, and after we were acquired by Facebook, Parse, we were doing a lot of things that were kind of, it was years before its time. We didn't have the name for microservices and stuff, but that's what we were doing. And it was this massive multi-tenant architecture where, you had millions of mobile apps sharing same backend components, and one app hits the top of the iTunes charts every other day. And you're just like, where the fuck is this traffic coming? Sorry. Where is this traffic coming from? And none of the tools that were around were helpful.
Yeah.
We were starting from scratch every time, because it's not always the app with the most traffic that's hurting you. Sometimes it's the one with that just shipped also these mobile apps, they could all ship new versions at any time, and you have no knowledge or control over it, right? And the tools that were available were just not helpful, because they were all built from monoliths, right? They all assumed that the top 10 list would tell you what was wrong, right? And they just didn't. And it was professionally embarrassing to me that our uptime was sometimes 98% in a month. It was terrible. We were also using MongoDB when in the early days, when there was one lock per replica set. So multi-tenancy was we were swimming upstream, as it were. But we got to Facebook, and Facebook obviously had built some really powerful tools for understanding their web app. Most of which didn't help us really, but there was one that did. It's called Scuba, and Scuba was butt ass ugly. It was hostile to users, but it did one thing really well, which is just slice and dice on high cardinality dimensions in basically real time. And this, we started feeding some data sets from our backend into it, and the time it took us to figure out which app was constraining any resource in our system just dropped to seconds, and that's how we finally got a handle on our problems. And it made such an impact on me that when I was leaving, I was just like, nothing like this exists, and I don't know how to engineer anymore without it. It's become so core to how I, not just how I do my job, but how I see the world, how I decide what to build, and how I know if it's working. And it's like my five senses for production. And going back to not having it, I would be so much less powerful as an engineer.
So what kind of problems does that kind of help you parse out? Is it database issues, or is it memory? I guess, because obviously these are things that an average New Relic wouldn't be able to catch. I'm assuming these are more fine-grained.
Yeah, well, interestingly, New Relic is kind of a special case. We almost didn't start this company because I kept looking at New Relic and going, God, they say that they do all this, and I can tell what their backend looks like, and I can tell that they're gathering enough data to answer these questions. And I was just so sure that any day now they were going to figure it out, and they were going to ship a version that would just crush us. and they still haven't. And I just can't really explain it. But it is much more. So, if you think about, old school monitoring, like the type that I, grew up using, it's much more about, sitting between the hardware and the software at a very low level. And it's describing all these low level resources to you. And you, like, as a front end engineer, are rightly like, why should I care about the counters on my Ethernet 0 interface?
Yeah.
It's just like, you should not have to care about
Totally.
that. But this is the world that everyone's kind of lived in, is that if you actually care about the performance of your app, you have to be half of an ops person. And the entire ops profession is kind of sat between software engineers and their software, just explaining it to them back and forth. It's like, your code is doing this now, right? Which is not great. And especially as like the abstractions keep moving up the stack, more and more, my belief is that you shouldn't have to know much about your underlying system. Like, think about the serverless kids, right? Like, they're writing snippets of software. They don't know which processor it's running on, or which hard drive type, and this is definitely the future of something. It's just gotten too complex for anyone to, store all this in your head. So like, by moving up the stack a little bit, our approach, the observability approach, is much more, you're speaking in the language of, of your code, of the variables and the endpoints and, the stuff that you're looking at every day. I think there's only like 3 hardware, metrics that I still think are relevant to software engineers, which are like, if you ship to change, is your memory just like skyrocketing? Are you chewing your CPU? Or is, like, for some apps, is the amount of space that you're using like drastically going up? And it's really the rate of change that you care about, not the units itself, right? That's really all that you should care about, and arguably, like, not even that. But what you do need to be able to see is, like, when you shift a change in your code, what was the impact on the system? Right? Like, did the calls to another endpoint like triple? Is the amount of data that you're just like shipping to that pipe like massive? And just like coordinating change, our systems have gotten so large that like debugging the code is not usually the problem. It's finding where in the system the broken code is. That's the problem.
Yeah, that makes sense, because like I'm relatively new to like working on these very large systems where there's like a lot of different pieces running. And one of the things that I've kind of noticed is you'll have like multiple different like you have like, rather than like might have a mono repo for, say, our UI or something like that, but at some point it always ends up going into the backend services, and then there's like multiple, even if you have a monolith, even like there's just so many different components that come in. You probably have custom modules.
You've got so many storage systems. You've got like, and like sometimes like the code that you're depending on doesn't even live on your servers, right? You might be calling a serverless, functions or Lambda or, something, and you have to be able to, you can't lose sight of your code when it hops around anywhere, right? Like, you need to be able to at the very least, tell how long did it take to call that thing, and what did you get back? Like, you need to be able to follow your request as it hops around the system. And in the olden days, 5 years ago, all of this was kind of bundled up with the process. So if all else failed, you could just attach a debugger and step through the process as it hopped around your system. Well, you can't even do that anymore, because now it hops the network all over the place, right? And I think it's the thing that made observability necessary was the emergence of, it was the breakup of the monolith. And I think that it's still better to build your code. It's still easier to develop using observability than without, because when is it ever not easier to see what's happening? I think that's what made it absolutely necessary, because our old ways of debugging just fell apart.
Okay. I'm kind of curious then, like, how does the debugging experience, so I haven't personally used Honeycomb, sorry, but what is like, if you're debugging using observability, like if you're getting like because I'm imagining like you're getting like a stack trace if there's an error, or you're getting logs, or.
So here's a couple of like examples. The way that we recommend the right way to do things, which almost nobody is doing, is to start with an SLO, right? Where you've got a budget. You've got like, okay, my budget, it's fine. I think that the impact on my users will be fine if, I'm at like 99.5 requests succeed, over this interval. So you set a budget, and then, if your error budget starts, getting paid down really quickly, if your if you're running out, if you're going to run out, then it would alert someone. And the reason this is the right way to do things is because the days of alerting people on symptoms have also reached kind of the end of their lifetime, because there's so much noise in it, right? Like if you're alarming on, well, this system resource, spikes, like that happens like a gazillion times a day. And you can either like manage, just like make an art form out of managing, these hundreds of thousands of, thresholds and alarms and like triggers and like, which, and you'd still either burn your people out, because false positives are the worst for burning people out. Getting paged at 3 a.m. going, oh, that's a blip. Like you're going to get real cynical real fast. or the impact on your users is going to go undetected for too long, right? Because what actually matters is not how healthy is your system. And this is something that I think a lot of ops people and backend engineers are having a hard time making the mental switch from. It doesn't actually matter how healthy your system is. What matters is the impact on your users, right? Nobody cares about your beautiful system that's at 99.99999% if your user is still like, it's timing out for me, right? And because maybe the request is never reaching your system, or maybe you're not capturing it, for whatever reason. Like what matters, like nines don't matter, right? If people aren't happy.
Totally.
So measuring it from your user's perspective, and then setting a budget on that, and then letting if. And the cool thing about this is that you can set different, burn down rates for nighttime versus daytime. If you're on call on this daytime, you probably want to know right away if something's, really paying down those doors. If you don't have nearly that level of caring, if it's the middle of the night, right? It should be like you're gonna run through your budget by morning, right? That's when it should wake you up. So if you get paged by an SLO alarm that's going off, just like wow, then you jump on. Another cool thing about observability, and there's a lot of technical things that I could go into. The cool thing about observability is that you can go from very high level to very low level and back without having to jump from tool to tool, right? So you're looking at the same data, you're just inspecting it and aggregating it in different ways. So you can go to the very high level, like your error budget is high, down to which requests are erroring and how are they different from all of the other requests, or the mean or the baseline. And then, so like in a click or two, you can go, oh, they're different in these ways. Maybe it's all the requests that are going to that endpoint or that shard on that database, or for this user or this shopping cart, or, you could just, because it's just that easy. You just click, this is why they're different. And then hopefully, that tells you enough. If not, you might want to go, okay, well, trace one of those for me. Show me the trace of it, and maybe that'll show you why. But from there on, if the easy things don't, then you just play with it until you find it. But pretty much always, if you know your systems moderately well, just seeing what is different about what is erroring than the others is enough to inform you. Now, if you don't have SLOs set up, then a lot of people are still, they have their various alerts or whatever. But and so I'm kind of cheating a little bit here, because Honeycomb has done a bunch of stuff to automate, like you just click on this and see what's different about them. If you didn't have Honeycomb and you were trying to do the observability from scratch, it would be like, okay, let's say your errors are high. So start at the edge, right? Like we break down by endpoint. Which endpoints are erroring? Oh, it looks like it's only the right endpoints, or whatever. So are all of the right endpoints erroring? No, it looks like just the ones to this particular backend. Well, is it all of the requests to this backend? No, it looks like it's just the ones to that shard, or just the ones to, or it's spread across all shards. What do they have in common? And it's just kind of this like iterative process of, but what's magical about this is it doesn't require a lot of knowledge. You just ask the question and you follow the data where it takes you, right? And it's difficult to overstate how different this is from the old way of debugging, which really rested on a lot of intuition and a lot of scar tissue, a lot of knowledge of past outages, right? Because if all you have are these dashboards you can't really like repeatedly ask these questions of, then it's like looking at art on the wall going, I bet it's Redis. And then you go look for evidence that your guess is correct, right? And if it's not correct, you make another guess, and then you go look for evidence that your guess is correct, which, like, for most of computing history was good enough, was pretty good, because systems tended to fail in very predictable ways, right? And as soon as you narrowed down the component or whatever, then you would like SSH in and start, debugging it that way. But now there's just too many components that, like, you're not failing predictable ways. It's more like, when you've got a mature shop, every time you get paged should be something different, which is kind of terrifying, right? Like, your intuition, it's terrifying, but it's also awesome, because in the olden, I keep saying olden days, but like, what that meant was that the debugger of last resort, the person who knew your systems best, would always be the engineer who had been there the longest.
Right. Yeah, of course. Which
it's really kind of depressing.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. I mean, it's because, like, it requires like a lot of like specific knowledge about different parts of the application, and I guess.
And it just requires you to have been through outage after outage after outage, so that you can kind of match the pop art on the dashboards to understanding how to interpret it, because it by itself, lacking that context, it makes no goddamn sense.
Yeah, it's like the idea of like the grizzled staff engineer that just kind of comes in and war torn and
it wasn't healthy. It's not healthy, right? But we relied on those people, and I say this because that was me. And there's no greater feeling of just raw power than being the person who can just saunter into the room and go, it's Redis. I know it doesn't say it anywhere on that dashboard, but trust me, it's Redis. Like, I fucking love that. Like, those are the good old days. I love that feeling. This is why I've always been I like being the first engineer to join and start an infrastructure team, right? Because I love that. I love being that person. And so I've reluctantly decided to sacrifice my ego for the good of the commons.
Totally. Yeah. I think that's a good point, because it's like, I think that's like really cool, because it's like, the idea is like, at the end of the day, it's like you want to get things out of like individuals, right? Like, you don't want one point of failure who's like kind of dependent or like needs. I think the other thing is like, one of my questions that I really wanted to ask you is like, how do you think like a new engineer who is doing on-call for, say, the first time, or is getting new to that process, like how should they approach it? Like, what do they need to know to like do a good job and not like royally screw anything up or like miss a page, I guess? I mean, not miss a page. That's just don't.
Yeah. So I think that I realize I'm talking smack about, other technologies, and I don't really mean it that way. It's just the right tool for the job, right? And we haven't really had the right tool for the job for a long time. The really unfortunate thing about, the old generation of tools was that they really didn't reward curiosity. It was more like, if you're on call for the first time, you see a spike, and you're like, what's that? Somebody's likely to shut you down. Just go, happens all the time. Like, don't pick up that rock, like, if you start looking for things, you're gonna find things, and which is the truth, because our systems have been like these just spat up hairballs that nobody's ever understood, and we're just like shoving more shit in there every day that like nobody understands, and like, it's fine, right? It's gonna be fine. But like, once having the ability to go from very high level to very low, those specific rows starts to unlock real answers. Like, the goal ultimately is just to reward that curiosity, right? Your tooling should reward. What I've seen happen a few times now is you take teams who are reasonably good engineers, but like old style of tooling, and you give them like actual observability. Well, before long, it takes a while, whatever. The best debugger on the team is the person who's the most curious, the person who like regularly looks at their code after it's shipped and goes, what's that? And then takes a few minutes and tries to figure it out. Because a few minutes I think is reasonable. You should be able to spend a few minutes just going, this thing I just inflicted upon the world, what's going on under there, right? Like, not hours. Hours is not reasonable, but minutes is reasonable. And if you do that regularly, you're going to be pretty good at this. Like, it shouldn't be that hard. You shouldn't have to specialize in observability or in debugging. You shouldn't have to, it should just answer your questions if you invest a few minutes of curiosity and time. And I think that like part of the uphill battle that we face is just, convincing people who have been burned, who have been burned out, to like reawaken that curiosity and that willingness to look and to play around and to just kind of, because typically when you put people on call for the first time, they're a little nervous, they're a little excited, which is I think the right mixture, right? Like, you're in charge of maybe a multi-million-dollar, organization, this stream of revenue. Like, that's a big responsibility. And I don't think that this is a bad thing. I actually think that done well, on call is a thing that brings meaning to our work, right? It ties us to our users and the impact on them. And it makes it clear that like we're not just like building sky castles in the cloud. Our work has real world impact, right? And I feel like being tethered to that responsibility, like it shouldn't burn people out. It shouldn't. I feel like being woken up once a year, maybe twice a year, is something that is reasonable to expect from an engineer who works for one of these, 24/7 online services. There's plenty of other software that you can write if you don't want to be responsible for your code. But if you choose to work for these companies, I do think that you have a responsibility, like, and the responsibility doesn't end until the user's experience. So I think that the unfortunate thing is that for cultural, social, and technological reasons in the past, we have abused this ownership and this responsibility, and we have not treated people with respect. We have not treated their time with respect, their sleep with respect. And so we have some work to do now to crawl out of this hole. And this is a management problem. This is not an engineering problem. This is a problem where managers should be held to a higher standard, I think.
Right.
To answer your question, if you give engineers the right tools, I believe that we want to do well, right? I believe that we want to do well. We want to understand what we're doing, and it's like leading a horse to water, and then they know what to do.
Yeah, I like the idea of just. I mean, obviously, if you're not using certain tools, like you might have a different experience, but just being curious about how the services are running and like digging into it. Like, I feel like even outside of the on-call loop, that might be useful for myself, for instance, like as a front-end engineer.
Yeah. It never doesn't make you a better engineer to just follow the signal, a few more steps. Production is a superpower, like understanding your code, like understanding algorithms and data structures is one thing, but it is far from the whole story, right? Like your code that goes out there and interacts with the world, right? All of the hardware and the architecture and the users and their behavior patterns. And if you actually want to be a good senior engineer, it's kind of on you to feel responsible for knowing some of that, right? And it is a rabbit hole, absolutely. There and you do have your primary job, which is shipping features, but I don't think that anyone can really legitimately be a senior engineer until they understand basic things like what happens to my code when I merged it,
right?
Like how does it get out there,
and
how do I debug it in basic ways, and it's kind of about building up just a spidey sense, right? Just like an intuition for this isn't going to be good or that this is going to be bad, because that saves you so much time in the long run if you just train. But you have to train your mental corpus on real data, which means training it on staging is not going to get you very far.
Yeah, like if you're just like, or the other side of it is like what we were discussing before, where at an agency, you're kind of just starting a new project and you get things done really, really quickly. And then you move on to the next thing and you start over. Yeah. And because you're going through that cycle, you get really good at like, delivering features quickly or whatever. And then you don't at all even think about.
You get really good at reading the first chapter.
Yeah.
You've got that shit memorized, right? But like, then what happens? And I think that's a real skill in and of itself. Like I've often wished that, we could send every engineer to just like do a year at an agency, do a year at a Google or a Facebook. And then I feel like they would have graduated. We can call them a real engineer.
Totally.
But I honestly, I do like we were saying before, I feel like this is where software grows up, right? Like when you're writing code, knowing that it's going to be around for a while and that your code is going to mature like a fine wine, but other people are going to have to be responsible for it, right? There's a different, you build things in a different way when you know that you have to hand them off. I hope
totally.
because you can't rely on your intimate knowledge of from its infancy. By the way, one of my favorite quotes of the past couple of weeks of Twitter was that software ages like milk. but the context was that software before you get it into production ages like milk, because which I think is really, 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 really important, because once you've written that code, it needs to be into production like 15 minutes. It can be behind feature flags, but it does age like milk as soon as you've written it, because what ages isn't the software, it's your understanding of the software, right? And that delta between when you've written it, when you have the original intent, you know what you did, why you did it, and when it's in production being used by users is very dangerous territory. You forget it very quickly, you move on to something else. And the longer that interval is, the harder of a time you're going to have figuring out what went wrong with it.
I think that cycle of delivering, of pushing to prod within, say, like 15 minutes of finishing a feature, it sounds a little bit terrifying, but I do like the idea.
It is. It's terrifying if you're trying to move from a large system that was not built this way to be this way. If you just do it this way from the beginning, it becomes impossible to imagine doing it any other way. It seems terrifying to do it any other way. You're just like, what happens to that code? God, that's actually terrifying. Right? I think it was like the third week of Honeycomb that I wrote a little cron job in Bash that just like deployed whatever was on master to production every 15 minutes. It's still there. And I honestly think that, so at Honeycomb, up until a couple months ago, we had 8 engineers working on Honeycomb for the past 2 years for everything from, the homebrewed storage engine, the query planner, the application, all of the integrations, the UI, the UX, the security, on call, like working with customers. 8 engineers, hundreds of customers. There is no fucking way that we could have done that without that really tight, because in that interval, if you aren't shipping your changes immediately, that means somebody has to deploy it. And if somebody is deploying manually, that means that changes are going to start getting batched up. And that's like the danger zone. As soon as your changes are getting batched up into, different releases, this means that anytime you ship, instead of one possible diff by one possible person that could have done it, it just blows. And that's when you get into like entire days spent trying to figure out, doing git bisect, trying to figure out whose change was it, because they're all intersecting, all the changes are intersecting with each other in novel ways. And it's just a nightmare. And so then you need an SRE team, you need build engineers, you need and then you need more managers to manage all this complexity, and everybody's waiting on each other for other things. It's just, I've done some back of the envelope, calculations, which ring correct to me and to a few other people that I've run this by. But my estimation is that if you take, N is the number of engineers it takes to write and support this project, if you're shipping within 15 minutes. If you're shipping within hours, it takes twice as many. If you're shipping within days, it takes twice as many again. If you're shipping in weeks, it takes twice as many again. And this is how you can see, so if Honeycomb was shipping within days instead of within minutes, we would need to be an engineering team of nearly 100.
Right. Yeah. Wow. That's interesting, because I did have I was going to ask you about the difference between like smaller teams versus larger teams. And I guess in my mind, I assumed that Honeycomb was a huge team, but it's really surprising to hear that it's only 8 engineers or was. I don't know if it's still.
We just doubled the size of our engineering team and added a bunch of product design.
I hope that's not because you shifted to hour-long delays.
No, not at all. Because we got funding, which will be public by the time this goes.
Okay, cool. Coming from, say, Facebook and then moving into your own company, what's been like the biggest change, or like what have been some of the larger changes there in terms of like management and like?
I will talk shit about Facebook sometimes, but I will say that everything that I learned at Facebook, none of it was engineering, by the way. It was all management, bureaucracy, power plays. It's in retrospect, it's hard for me to imagine starting a company without that experience. It was valuable. It was really valuable. It wasn't enjoyable, but it was very valuable. My role at Facebook was really just shit umbrella. Acquisitions are tough. Acquisitions are real tough. And Parse got shut down shortly after I left. So many fields. I in retrospect, I realized that I stayed too long at Facebook. I stayed because I loved my team so much and I loved the product so much, and because I was able to shelter them and they did some amazing things. But now I look back and I'm like, is it really good that I did that? Because all of their work was for nothing. Maybe I should have left sooner, because everything we built was just turned off a year later, and it lasted as long as it did because I was there.
Right.
And maybe it would have been healthier to let it die a more natural death sooner. So
I guess that's that feels, it's kind of like, I guess in when it gets so large in the organization, it's just kind of like randomly shifting around.
Well, Facebook is there to build Facebook. They weren't there to build Parse, you know, and I don't blame them for that. You know, it was, the acquisition was this cockeyed idea that it would just never really fit in with their strategy. You know, they had this idea that we could help them make developers love them, but we joined and we're like, we can help you do that. Stop making breaking changes. And they're like, we're definitely not going to do that. And we were like, well, I got nothing. You know, like developers are not going to love you unless you stop shipping breaking changes to your SDKs and APIs. Yeah. And they just weren't even going to hear that. And their strategy pivoted away from making developers love them shortly after that. And so there was no reason for Parse to be there. I mean, the thing that I do hold some bitterness about was that I understand that when they decided to shut Parse down, other companies made offers for it and they chose to shut it down anyway. That I'm bitter about.
Yeah.
That I'm real bitter about.
I heard about it from like the perspective of people who are running applications on it, and it was so surprising for them. It was
ahead of its time. It was visionary. And one of the things that Parse did so well, that was, God, this was 10 years ago. God, wow. Was building a really beautiful, well-designed, like clean. It was so pretty and it was so well thought through and it was so elegant. It wasn't just like slap, you know, stick a function on there. Oh, somebody wants this. Let's put a feature. You know, it was really elegant and well designed. Like it changed the way I thought about software. You know, like I had never considered design to be that. I mean, my command line, my Vim windows, you know, I'm just like,
yeah.
But like when we started Honeycomb, like that was something that it really changed. I was, you know, we have to build consumer quality developer tools because guess what? Developers are humans too. Like they fall prey to the same sort of like, you know, and like if we can just build products that like treat them like people and with the same, you know, blind sites and you know, we should not rely on everyone having to, you know, memorize a bunch of command line tricks. It should be we should think through like what are they trying to, you know, all the stuff that's super basic. I know you're a front-end developer, but like it was legitimately mind-blowing to me, and I think it accounts for a lot of the passion and the attachment that so many people felt to Parse.
For sure. Yeah. No, I can understand how like the experience, like I've used a lot of tools that aren't super like intuitive, and it makes your job just a lot harder because you're spending your time, you know, hitting your head against the CLI or.
Yeah, it's just gravel. It's like you're just trying to like slide around through your day. You're just like friction everywhere. It takes you out of what you're trying to do because you have to go deal with the fucking tool and then the other fucking tool and then the tools together. And you're just like, I'm trying to just do this thing. Will you just let me do my thing? Right? Because the tools have not been built to let you do your thing. The tools were built to do their thing, right? And I think that this is a real, like, this is just starting to reach the back end world, and I'm so jazzed.
So, and then like it's kind of neat because like that sort of sorry, rather what I was gonna say is it might not exist, and then what ends up happening is a lot of teams build their own, and
yes. Stop building your own.
And like internal tooling is always like no one actually wants to deal with it.
No one wants to deal with it. Nobody. Like, I really honestly feel like software engineering, if software engineers were just a little less good at writing software, the world would be so much better. You know, I feel like I genuinely feel like the world needs more people like me who are firm and mediocre like software engineers, because we're just like, can I do anything to avoid writing software? I will do that thing. I will write software as a last resort, and that means it is always fucking necessary.
Which is like the true definition of like an engineering leader. Like, I mean, it's like I think that it's funny because like my immediate like assumption is just like go in and try and build something and then like do all the wrong things. Like that's like, I think like
somebody's gonna have to maintain that.
Yeah. It's like as you get better and like learn more, you realize more and more that you don't have to do as much, I guess. And
you don't have to do all that. You don't have to do nearly as much of that, right? Like maybe we could just use a simple curl for a while until we know if we need to build something that's like redundant and resilient and like all this stuff. Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
Did I mention that our build system is still a bash script in cron?
Yeah. which is kind of crazy to think about, because do you use like CI/CD and all of, like, I mean, obviously you do, for sure.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Do you use any particular tools that are like your favorites?
we use Circle CI. It's great. It's wonderful. Like I really feel like there's like this dark spot here between most people. CI/CD has come a long way, but then when it comes to getting the code out there to production, there's a lot of like, there we dragons. A lot of shops are still like writing their deploy stuff from scratch because there's Capistrano, which, oh God.
I actually don't know what's Capistrano, sorry?
Capistrano is like the Ruby deploy script, which has been hacked to oblivion by pretty much everyone who's ever had to deploy code. Yeah, it's very useful. Capistrano is amazing. Please don't at me. But like, I feel like there's people need to get their stuff out fast. There's this big gravitational shift that I think is going on right now from pre-production to production. Like all of this energy that we've spent crafting like these elaborate staging environments, and every developer gets their own unique environment, we'll containerize it, and we'll like all this fucking energy, and then production is just like, we build nothing for it, and that has to be reversed. Like it's not that I'm saying staging is bad, never use staging. There are some legitimate use cases for staging, but for too many people, it's become a crutch. It's become a way not to get their code out fast. And for too many teams, it's become the place that they invest all of their energy instead of investing the energy into production, right? And I think that like so many companies would be better off to get staging, like just like wipe it out, just like don't even use it, but get used to really looking at production, really tooling production, so that you can roll changes out safely, do like rolling releases, do like stage deploys, do like progressive deployments, have ways of inspecting that at a very fine level, couple that with observability, couple that with feature flags so that, you have decoupled releasing and deploying, right? That's a really powerful thing, right? That will really help people move fast. And you see all of these little, tooling companies springing up right now that are so focused around, production and that point of code meeting production. And I think that's going to be a really exciting thing for the next few years, because that I'm just like I'm like stuttering. I'm so excited. But like it pays off fast, and it pays off materially. It pays off, viscerally, the things that you learn the things that you learn in your gut when you're working on production are eternally valuable.
Right. Yeah. Like, I mean, it's my first experience working with feature flagging, and it's like the coolest thing ever. I set up a flag on my first week, and then we had like a feature behind a flag, but we were like working on a new, like migrating some existing code over to like a new UI system. And it was just like the coolest thing ever to be like, oh, I can go on the website and turn on the flag for myself, and like I can see my changes here, and like it's half done. It's like it says like new UI coming soon, but I'm like, I did that.
But it's there. Yeah, it's great, and you get to do that without fucking up anyone else's day.
and it was so panic inducing when I did it, right? I merged it, and I was just sitting there like, I don't know what's going to happen. Like I'm looking at code. I was looking at all the channels on Slack. Like, okay, if there's an alert there, oh, that's my fault. It has to be my fault. It's an unrelated project, but I must have. And then when I realized it just worked, and I was like, it's like such a cool feeling. Like and every single merge is like that. It's not like, oh, like I went through the cycle, I got approval. Okay, now I can merge it into the feature branch. It's like, it's out there.
Yeah. It's out there. It's real. There's so, and I feel like this, it is so exciting, and it's so visceral, and it's just like, and that there's like this snowball effect of just like, when you get excited about doing the right things, you do the right things more, right? And it feels really good to do the right things, and to see them out there, and to see them fast, and so I'm actually pretty optimistic about software in the near term.
Cool. I did want to ask you a bit about the topic that I wrote was building a strong engineering culture.
Oh, right. We haven't talked about that at all.
Not at all. But I also like this because I think the tooling and like the ability, like what you're talking about now is like empowering people, right? So that's like a huge part of it. Like if I don't feel like I can get my job done, I'm going to be miserable no matter like how many perks the company has or whatever. Get
burned out by shipping. Engineers get burned out by not shipping. No, it totally is about empowering people. And like, I feel like I have this enormous rant right now that I may never publish, but it's just like, this is like the cardinal failure of engineering leadership of our generation, is that we have almost categorically like failed to make the case successfully for continuous delivery. And continuous delivery is something that if you get it right, like it's like the top of the waterfall, right? Like if you get it wrong, you can never recover from it, right? Because like if that interval between when you write the code, when the code is deployed is long, well, that pathology is just, your diffs are going to be bigger, your delays are going to be longer, your approval is going to take, it's just like, and that, like, that's like your unit, like nothing can ever be faster than that, right? It's only going to be multiples of that time. And this is the source of so much pain and just like suffering in engineering lives. And it's so much wasted money, so much wasted time, so much, just all the bullshit that makes us Dilberty and cynical about software engineering, right? Like kind of proceeds from this. And it's an easy case to make to people who understand. Find me 10 engineers who don't want to do continuous delivery. I bet you can't. Like engineers are sold on this. They want to work on this. They want to work at places that do this. Like they're united in this. Now find me 10 teams that actually do it. That's a struggle, right? And I hold management like so responsible for this. And I get it. Like it is not an easy sell to make to management that in the near term we're going to slow down and have more errors and like more breakiness, and we're going to spend a lot of our time not on features. We're going to spend it on fixing our internal pipeline. But it's like any investment, like it will pay off within the year, I guarantee you. And from then on, like you'll be so much more competitive as a company. You'll be able to recruit better and retain better engineers, and they'll be happier and they'll spend more time on your precious features. It's just like, it is such a compelling argument. And I don't understand why we haven't made it. And I feel like leadership kind of, like every manager kind of tends to walk in the door and just accept the whatever mess they inherited, they'll make little tweaks, but they don't like radically reimagine it. And I just don't know. It's so plain to me. I don't understand what the problem is, but I think that there's a real competitive advantage there for companies who do this, right? Who do practice modern software engineering principles, who know that it's worth investing in that socio-technical system, the deploy pipeline, and, and in making the defaults the right ones, so that it encourages the right behaviors and all this stuff. Like, I feel like any team that has, about 10 engineers is getting to the point where they need to have someone who specializes in that internal tooling. But that doesn't mean that is the person who writes all the internal tooling. It means that you specialize in it, but it has to be the entire team's responsibility so that it's not just one guy, right?
Right, yeah.
But yeah, there's so much room for improvement here. The entire software delivery chain of Google or Facebook is now available to pretty much anyone. Just composable units like Honeycomb and Launch Darkly, and you can just buy and sell it off the shelf, right? Like, it is super cheap. It's hella cheap, like compared to hiring engineers to like build and maintain this yourself. And I feel like we hit our numbers last year, even with the pandemic. I think that this is an idea that is kind of, I hope it's an idea that is its time has come, and I'm doing everything I can to yell about it. But I think that I have another piece that I've been working on about, do engineering managers need to be technical? Because every time this topic comes up, people tell me stories about how the best manager they've ever had was someone who was completely non-technical. And I believe them. I absolutely believe them. However, I think those people are unicorns. I think that they have superpowers that they've learned to lean on to compensate in some incredible ways. And I also think that they're often people's favorite manager because they don't know enough to correct them, or they just give them free rein. They're just like, you own it. And I think that sometimes that's good. I think it's better to have an engineering manager who's actually equipped to like evaluate the caliber of your work. I think that doesn't feel as good as complete trust, but I think it is objectively better.
I was thinking like my first ever role, I kind of had a manager like that he was like our digital head, but his focus was on like the strategy and the idea behind it and some of the design and stuff like that. And he let me have free rein, and I loved the experience. But I came out of that, I learned a lot from doing it, but I didn't know what was like, which pieces were good and which pieces were bad. Like I just learned all these habits and then internalized all of them initially, and then had to like unlearn a whole lot of stuff.
We have to get better as an industry. We have to get a little bit more, I think, systematic at that. And we are such a an apprenticeship industry, right? Like you're not going to know best practices unless you get to work with other people who can teach them to you, because there's just too much, right? Like you can learn some stuff from staying up on Twitter and, Hacker News or whatever, but it's going to be a little uneven. and it's really better to just get to it. There are a couple of people who I got to work with early in my career who I credit was like everything. I learned it by osmosis just from watching them work because they were so effective. And there's like these sort of genealogical threads that I think you can trace, like the Google way and the Facebook way, the Oracle way, and they've kind of mutated and merged, and it would be a really interesting like grad school project, I think. But
I'm interested in kind of contrasting those, because I think my experience has always been in smaller organizations. Like I think the largest engineering team I worked on was 30 people. And that was because there was multiple agencies working together. And so like the back end was handled by one team, and the internal operations was handled by the actual internal company. And then the front end development was handled by our team. And then we had another team that was kind of like architecture. It was chaotic, but it was still, even there, it was a kind of small. I mean, maybe that's not small, I guess, but if I'm comparing that with like Google, I talked to a lot of Google engineers last year, and my question was always like, what's the hardest part about your job? And it was always, well, like there's like 10 different ways to do things. And, there's a dozen different people that like kind of have some context, and there's one expert, but you don't know who it is. And you've got to go and find that person. And it just seems like a totally different job almost.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely. You spend very little time actually writing software.
That's
because like you'll be in meetings most of the hard part is figuring out which code to write and what you're allowed to write, and making sure that someone hasn't already written it. And it's just it's a political job in many ways. I think it's a good experience. Like I do think what I think that those companies really excel at is taking new grads and within 3 to 4 years making them very competent engineers. Like they just like their entire pipeline is optimized for that, right? Because they have high attrition, and they're very good at that. And the unfortunate thing is that most of those engineers don't then just leave. I really think that like you should get your 3 years in and then you should go. Do not become a lifer. Like too many people become lifers, or they get hooked on the high pay, the perks, and the sell. I will tell you though, oh my God, that money spigot. Yeah, I got fucking addicted to that money spigot. That money spigot is just like money. It's just like, I miss the money spigot. I do. I really do. I'm never going to make that much money again, ever. But like, and I recognized that I was getting a little too comfortable with the money spigot. So I left around 3 years. But I think that a 3-year stint at a big company is a really good thing. I think it's a really good, you learn a lot of discipline in a lot of ways. And you learn how to think about systems as systems in ways that are, you can't get that experience anywhere else in the world. And I think it's so fascinating and so incredibly valuable. But you spend very little time actually writing code, unless you're on a team that's like prototyping and has no responsibilities whatsoever, so.
True. Yeah. I mean, I guess so. Like, that's kind of funny, because like one of the things I've heard a lot in podcasts and like interviews with people who are like building tools like Honeycomb or Launch Darkly is that like what they export from the company like doesn't work. And I've heard you say this before, which is why when you're exporting something from like Facebook or Google or whatever, it doesn't really apply to everywhere else, because like, I guess like the complexity is just not the same. Like, it's just like nobody in the world is dealing with Google's problems.
Nobody's Google infrastructure for everyone else is like hilarious. No, nobody has Google problems. And the SRE book was it's such a fascinating capsule. That said, I do think that, Google has like has problems like 10 years before we do, right? Like, but we do follow in their wake. Like they made, what was a Spanner or something, and then like 10 years later, we're all like, what do we use for service discovery? Because it did become relevant for all of us, not in exactly the same way, but the trend lines, the patterns are definitely there. Yeah, and it's kind of funny, like even like at Honeycomb, like we dog food the hell out of like we are the biggest Honeycomb user, because we're just like stuff everything in Honeycomb. But like just last year, I kind of realized we had sort of implicit dependency on continuous delivery. If you're wondering why I started ranting about this stuff, it's not out of the goodness of my heart. It's because I want more customers. Because I realized that if somebody has a 2-month deploy pipeline, what need do they have for, real-time understanding of their systems, really? Because,
Right.
That's just a long time. They're kind of like, and it's not that they don't care about the uptime of their systems, but like, I don't know, it's just a very different cultural thing. We we are a tool for people who have a much faster cadence, and I do think it is better for everyone, but it's also very selfishly motivated. I just really do want more customers. but,
Totally.
but like we realized like years ago when we were first raising money that, an investor said to us, he's like, it feels to me like you guys are only going to be really successful if the entire world gets better at writing software. And I went, yeah. And I meant it excitedly. And he was just like, you're doomed.
Okay, so what do I need to learn to like bring my, like if I was to go and start a 20-person or like a 5-person startup, like what do I need to know to like implement to like then become like the perfect Honeycomb customer? I'm curious.
Just set up continuous delivery.
That's it?
Yeah, absolutely. You would be and that's it. And then start it early. Like I think a lot of these practices, it's so much easier to write code if you do it the right way from the beginning. There's a lot of friction and pain and suffering trying to take a stable, working, money-making system that was built using very old paradigms and move it into the modern era. And it's a lot of pain and suffering that you're going to get a lot of pushback on because it doesn't seem necessary because it is stable and working. Maybe it's burning a few people out every year, but like from management's perspective, they might be fine with that, which is another thing I'm pretty upset about. But like just starting from the beginning, using observability, using feature flags, using continuous delivery, it's like it is so much easier to write and ship and maintain code that way because you're able to pull it into the time frame of like human instincts and intuitions and just like you're looking at the code 15 minutes after you wrote it and going, is it doing what I wanted it to do? Does anything else look weird? Like you catch like 80% of all bugs like right there and then if you're just looking at it. If you instrument it in, you're looking at that instrumentation going, is it doing what I expected? And that means that's 80% of the bugs that aren't around to fester and become like embedded into the system to be part of the behavior that your users expect, right? Like, let alone be discovered, 6 months later and some other engineer is trying to figure out what the hell you were thinking, right? Like it's so much easier to fix those things, but closing that loop of actually looking at it is just really essential.
So like, this is something that you mentioned earlier, like making sure that anyone can understand the system and like spreading that knowledge. How do you document that and like share, like, how do you go about sharing that knowledge so that, I don't necessarily need to talk to you directly or mentor directly underneath someone to actually know how to do what they do?
That's such a great question. I have so many thoughts and feelings on this. I really think that documentation is a losing battle. I think that, for services, every service should have a landing page that has like, here's who owns it, here are some good starting points, some useful, queries or whatever. But I don't think, and obviously it reflects like the type of software that I write and everything. I think there are industries where documentation is obviously essential, for fast moving, internet services, modern things like where you and I work. I think it's a losing battle and a time sink. I think that it's usually a sign that if you've written the code well, but here's the thing, like I think that instrumentation needs to take the place of documentation because instrumentation is, your code, it combines your original intent, with your code, with, where it's running and reports something actually in real time, to you about reality. And that is how I think you make these systems understandable. And furthermore, this speaks to a lot of what we're building on Honeycomb because, we have always, how to talk about this? Like, okay, so when you're building a system, your piece of it intimately, right? You know everything about it. You don't know everything about all the other pieces of the system, but when you're debugging something, you kind of have to know enough to, navigate throughout the entire system to make sure, it's your part or whatever. And each of your coworkers is the same, right? They know their parts of the system intimately. So, your observability tooling should have, your history, all the queries that you ran and your team's history, all of the questions that they were asking. So, when you have a question about, my part of the system, you should be able to look at my history and go, or if you're like, when was the last outage that we had that was like this? Maybe it's a MySQL problem, right? And I don't know MySQL, but I know that the experts on the team are like Ben and Emily. And I feel like the last time Emily was on call, she had a problem like this. So I want to go look at what Emily asked and like what kind of things she posted to Slack around that time and what she thought was meaningful enough to be put in a postmortem. Or maybe there's something like this last Thanksgiving, I want to look at what anyone was doing last Thanksgiving that had to do with MySQL, just like kind of drawing on the hive mind sort of, so that like, if, maybe Ben's on vacation and I'm on call and it looks like it's his thing. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is go and look at, if there's a function name or something, I'm going to go look at Ben's questions, Ben's history, search for that function in Ben's history, to see like, what did he do? How did an expert in this part of the system interact with this part of the system? And so that I can kind of like piggyback on it, or maybe like kind of yoink something that he did and put it in my collection of useful queries, because like, we all have these like bookmarks and like our touch points, the way that we navigate the system using our deep familiarity, but like that stuff should be very shared. It should be very, something that you can kind of like draw on each other's brains and like the effluvia of how they interact with their part of the system.
Yeah, because what I've noticed is like the only way, like the main way that I've done that in the past or like learned that sort of thing is always through pairing with people individually, which works really well if you can do that. But
scale.
if it's, and is it like an asynchronous team too? Like if it's totally remote, I feel like what you're describing here makes so much sense for like a remote team where everyone's kind of dealing with their own things and people need to be able to like work off their own schedule and like look things up after the fact. Have you noticed any like huge change with like being, I'm assuming, were you co-located prior to the pandemic or were you always remote? Or?
We actually, Christina and I knew from pretty much the very beginning that we wanted to build a distributed team. However, we really loved having an office in the early days. And, it was just like 4 or 5 of us for the first couple of years. We were tight. But as soon as we started growing, we doubled down on it. And so we actually had our first distributed VP start 2 weeks before the COVID lockdown. Wow. So we were engaged all last year and like going distributed. And so it was a real smooth landing for us. Just like, oh, okay, everybody's staying home now. It was pretty much easy.
That's like perfect timing, I guess.
Yeah. And like, we don't want to be completely distributed because, and then some of our remote people are the most vigorous in this opinion, just that they want there to be a home base, and I need there to be some place that I go to every day. I need that separation between home and work because, I have sleep issues and stuff, but just having a home base, because then we have some place that people can fly in and just hang out. And it also means that our local people don't have to come into the office, right? Like I've always loved decoupling that link between being on a team and having to be at this place and this time. I think that it unlocks, much like continuous delivery, kind of like if you get continuous delivery wrong, you spend all of your time like sort of sweeping around trying to like deal with like the pathologies and like the side effects. I think that if you get this cultural thing like wrong, then what you get is like managers who are like managing based on how butts and seats, like how long were you here? Were you here late? And if you can kind of like break that, it forces your managers to be much more outcome oriented when they're managing. It forces them to look at actual impact. It's much more democratizing. It's more, I think it's a justice issue. You can't just hire people who can afford to live in the Bay Area. Like you just can't. That's really not fair. It's not fair to people with families. You're docking them. It shouldn't fucking matter where someone is if they're dialed into the meeting and doing their job, right? No questions asked. Health issues, like fuck it, I don't care. So that's why I've always felt really strongly about being a distributed team, while at the same time being passionately dedicated to having an office where I can go.
Yeah, I like that. Like I'm up in Toronto, so I'm in Canada. I mean, it felt like early on, it was like very, like at least a few years ago, it's very hard for us to like kind of even I come up with the idea of like working for a company in the US that's like, based out of the Bay Area or even like Bellevue or whatever. It's just not, it wasn't really like within the realm of possibility. And now with like the shift, it's like, oh, that's actually like more likely to happen. Cause like in this area, it's like, I mean, Toronto's an expensive city. It's not as expensive as San Francisco. But I think that like a lot of people want to move out of the city. And so especially for like, what I've noticed is that like being on a remote team, it seems like it's super comfortable for people with like families and with other priorities. And then for people who might be like a little bit, I kind of crave the environment, like the collaboration and meeting people and talking to people face to face. And so it's hard to replicate that digitally. So having like an office or somewhere to go to is super cool. For me right now, that's just become like either this podcast is a cool way to meet new people, and then talking to like my coworkers. And then there's a few people in Toronto that now will like meet up once in a while, which is kind of cool. And then even just like having past like coworkers and people that like I've built relationships with in the past that I can keep going back to is it's really helped a lot. But how have you dealt with like that sort of, have you ever had that issue like with the isolation part of it, or has anyone on your team felt that? And I'm curious if you have any ideas around that.
Whew. Yeah, that's an interesting one. It's a tough one. You know, what are cities going to be like post COVID? I guess I'm pretty bullish on cities. I think that like we just, and I say this as a deep introvert, you know, and I was raised in a fucking compound in the North Idaho where I was homeschooled and I didn't have friends or see people for the first 15 years of my life. So, you know, I have worked from home in the past and it has not been good for me. Like it's not, I will just stop leaving the house and I'll feel so comfortable with it while like objective like measures of my quality of life are just like, you're going down.
Yeah, you feel terrible, but you enjoy being at your little home base, right?
Yeah,
like that's kind
of get a little weirder as time goes on. Yeah, that's me. That's definitely me. That's why I structured my life to have like an office that I go to, and then fucking COVID comes. And so like, you know, the moral of the story is don't try. No, I think that you know, this is so individual. It's individual, but there are patterns, right? So I think that it's good to look for community wherever you are. I think we just crave being in the same space as other people. We like to think of ourselves as brain into jars, right? Like those of us on the internet, but we're not. We're mammals. We're deeply embedded in our place, in our time, in our friendships, and in our surroundings. And I think that was a realization that I did not have until well into adulthood. Makes me, I think, a late bloomer. But yeah, I think it's balance, right? And I don't think it's good for people to be alone for too long.
So when you're looking for like new team members and you want people to, I'm assuming that, actually, I'm curious how you feel about the whole culture fit idea in general. Because I was going to say, I assume that you're looking for culture fit, but I'm actually curious how I feel like you might have.
That's a really interesting question. We do not say that we're looking for culture fit. We're kind of explicitly from the beginning, we've been looking for kind of cultural diversity. Like we're more likely to ask ourselves, like, what does this person bring to the team that's new, you know, that we don't have? Honeycomb is an interesting example though. So like I keep forgetting this is very unusual, but it is like we will have hired, we're at 60-ish people now. We have hired about 100 people over lifetime of Honeycomb. We have never used a recruiter for anything except, I think, our VP sales position. This is very unusual. Like there's so much competition for talent right now. Our VCs keep like telling us all of our portfolio companies are struggling to hire right now. And we've never struggled to hire. And I think this because we talk so much about who we are and what we do. And so I think that it's very self-selecting. I think that a lot of people are really excited about the things we talk about and they would like to work someplace that espouses them. And so I think that we do have kind of culture fit. I worry that we have like cultural like monoliths just for that reason, right? I think that there are some unhealthy, people don't have to like be best friends and they don't have to love each other. This is a job. You know, one of our company values is actually we hire adults. We hire adults, and this means a lot of things. It means that, you know, we expect people to have lives, to not be able to work late or to set whatever fucking hours they want. Like maybe they're early, maybe they're late. Like we don't care. Maybe people have families, whatever. We also don't expect them to work crazy hours. Like I don't think that as an engineer, you have more than 4 hours a day of real focused hard work in you. Like your cognitive system just kind of expired. You can do other stuff, right? But those 4 hours are so much more precious to me than lots of hours just like doing this and that and like futzing around. I would so much rather someone just optimize for, give me 3 or 4. The business moves along on those 3 or 4 hours a day, like day after day after day. It's not all the other hours. So just like, give me those 3 or 4 hours a day. And then, I don't care. Right. So we can tolerate a lot of variance there. We're very intolerant on some small things, but we can tolerate a lot of variance. And I say this despite the fact that all of my best friends are people that I've worked with, right? Like I form friendships at work and I really value them, but I don't ever want to force people into feeling like they have to be my friend, right? I want it to be okay for them not to be my friend. So I think that we try to have managers who really understand and reflect like these values, because I think that a lot of culture gets set by managers unknowingly, because like we're hierarchical animals, and we kind of like instinctively, like we pay a lot of attention to the people who are above us in the totem pole, which I really dislike the up down, the sort of metaphor of corporate America where it's hierarchical. And I hate this because it triggers really intense rejection, like rebellious tendencies in me, and I'm a little scared of how intensely I'm really hard on people who are above me in the management chain. So I try to emphasize that management is a service job. It's a support job. It's not, the people who are creating the value, the reason that Honeycomb exists are not managers, right? Managers are not the most important people. It's the people it's not just engineers either, right? It's the people who are building the relationships in the sales side. It's the people, who are writing the copy, and then it's always people who are doing the work who should like, that is what actually makes you win as a company, right? It's putting the needs of those people first and treating management as sort of a support system. So I think that I value having people who relate to their work in a lot of different ways. There's plenty of room for people who are just like clock in, clock out, quietly do their work, and then go ski all day at Tahoe, right? I had some of those on my team, loved them, right? Yeah. And then there are the people who are all in, they're Honeycomb, they wear honey bee like onesie on Halloween, and they're just like goofy about it, I love that too. Like there's room for all of these types, as long as, they're outputting, the kind of work that we need, and as long as they're pleasant to deal with, as long as they're kind, as long as people enjoy interacting with them. But like, I think that's kind of I think the people who focus on culture fit are the people who they have an idea of what they want the company to feel like, and they think they deserve it. They think they deserve to get it, right? And I just don't really approach it that way.
I guess one of the things you said that I really liked was the idea that like it's not just engineering either. Like a lot of people, I feel like there's a lot of like glorification of engineering.
Yes.
And then to the point where like I've had friends who like work like, I don't know, like technical support or do like customer facing
citizens.
Yeah, exactly.
And I really hate that. I fucking hate that. And in fact, this is one of the few things we screen for in our interviews. If somebody talks shit about marketing or sales, or even just like really alienating remarks, like, I have no idea how they do that, like that's a red flag for me. We won't hire those people. I only want to hire engineers who see these people as their peers, right? As their coworkers who have an equally hard job, if not harder sometimes. Because of that, we've gotten some really amazing business people, because guess what? They're pretty sick of being shit on in our industry.
Totally. I can't imagine. Yeah. Because it's like being treated like your work isn't as important would just make...
You're being told outright that engineering is all that matters and everything else is nothing. And that's such bullshit. Like the hardest thing that I have done since starting this company, we've written a storage engine from scratch. The hardest part was trying to figure out how to talk about it, how to make it connect with people's work. It took me 6 months before I Googled the term observability and went, this feels like what we're trying to do. It's like, how do you understand what's inside a system by looking at the outside of a system? I was like, this is
that's so cool.
hardest thing that I have ever had to do, is trying to figure out how to talk about it. Because in the beginning, we were just like, well, we've had this experience. We know it was valuable. But then how do we deliver that to everyone? I knew it wasn't a monitoring product, right? Monitoring is too reactive. Just trying to figure out how to talk about it was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. So mad respect for product marketing people.
Yeah, no, that's, I was like looking at my like list of questions that I have, like things I really wanted to hear, like Well, I guess I'll just ask what motivates you? Like what motivated you, for instance, to start Honeycomb, but like also like what motivates you in general? Like you mentioned earlier, like the the golden handcuffs like aren't like the obviously not the driver. So I'm curious, like how do you stay
I will
motivated?
tell you, but I'm
Yeah.
not proud of this answer.
Okay.
I have the world's most overdeveloped fuck you sense. It is what powers me. And like I I have gotten so much propulsive energy in my life out of just being told no, or that I couldn't do something, or like I'm in college. I'm 16. I'm in college, and I've never really interacted with humans. And I was in the computer lab, and there were no girls there, and I was like, well, obviously this is where I belong, and I just never left. Uh, and when I was leaving Facebook, I was actually planning on going and being an engineering manager at Slack or Stripe or something. And there was a job at a company that I will not name that I felt like I was perfect for. It was a director role. I had just been like leading parsons engineering, and it wasn't a title, but like I knew these people, right? Like I knew the entire team. Like we had been working together on MongoDB bugs and like all this stuff. They knew me, they respected me. I knew their technical problems. Like they were poised for a bunch of growth. I was like, I would be great at that. And it would be growth for me, because like I kept getting offered jobs that were to do exactly what I had just done. Like, come be an engineering manager for my DevOps. And I'm just like, I don't repeat myself. Like, that's boring. Like, that would feel like a huge step back to me to just go do exactly what I've just been doing, right? Like,
Yeah.
have a and they turned me down for this job. They made some comment about how they felt like they could get the best people in the world for it now. And I was like, wow, fuck you. Serious fuck you. But they offered me a job as a manager, and they said that because they respected me so much, they wouldn't even ask me to, write code for 6 months before I, before I could become a manager like they usually do or something. And I was just like, so offended. I was so offended. And that's kind of when I was just like, nobody's ever going to nobody's ever going to hire me on promise, right? On the idea that I could step up and do more. So I'll start my own fucking company. There was a lot of fuck you in that. I just felt offended by the jobs I was being offered. And I don't blame them. I know, hiring is a very, people are very risk averse, I think, when they approach their hiring. There's also, there's all the science about how people hire men based on, their potential, and women based on what they've actually done, which is textbook what was happening to me. I don't really dwell on that shit, because it's also, it'll just get under your skin and make you see it everywhere if you start looking for it. But it also happens. I assigned myself a CTO title, and here we are. I think it is funny that, Christine, my co-founder, and I now, like, our respect for founders has just gone like this, because we're just like, I know how you got that title. Like, you didn't earn that either.
That is so funny. I mean, I think "fuck you" is a totally valid driver.
Like, with a smile on my face. Like, I'm not a bitter person.
Yeah.
I burn a lot of anger, but I burn it with a pretty clean burning fuel, I think. Like, it doesn't stick with me. I'm not like but like, if you're asking what motivates me, the thing that motivates me is fuck you. And I will just like springboard off that and do something
go
great.
Build a multi-million-dollar
exactly
company. Wow. That's amazing. I know some people who are like that's they're going to want to hear that.
It's something. So there's this book that I've read that I recommend for new managers. Even though I feel kind of sheepish about, I don't like personality tests. I don't think that they're valid, but there's this one called the four tendencies. Yeah, the four tendencies. And it's basically, it's a question of what motivates you, right? Because there's your internal sense of what you want, the goals you set for yourself. There's the external, what goals other people set for you, and then there's your reaction to those two things, right? There's only four possible permutations. There's, you find it very fulfilling to uphold and carry out your own goals for yourself and other people's goals for you, or you find it very easy to stick to other. There's people who like need a gym buddy, right? They can't stick to their own goals for themselves for anything, but you give accountability. They can stick to other people's, desires for them. Then there's people who don't give a fuck about other people's desires, and they could always do the things that they set for themselves, right? And then there are the people who reject both. And that's just my type. That's just my type.
Yeah.
As soon as I set a goal for myself, I no longer want to do it. And so like the trying to figure out how to navigate my own psychology has been like an evolving and never ending part of my adult life. So it just is what it is.
Yeah, I feel like it's like I always thought of it like I'm like I don't know when I'm gonna be like an adult. Like I don't know when I'm just gonna grow up. Like I'm just gonna keep getting in my way until
keep waiting.
Yeah.
What type are you out of those four?
I'm trying to think because I think I'm self-driven. I think because I've needed like a gym buddy in the past, for example, to like get started. But once I think I go through the motions and then just keep doing it. Like, I'm just like, oh, it's habit now. It's not about like a goal per se, right? So I don't know. Does that even, I guess it's.
So if you had 2 weeks off, or say you had 6 months off, like you're independently wealthy, what would you do with your time? Would you like pick up some, programming projects and like build something? Would you get up every day at the same time and like stick to, would you be able to achieve something, or would you find it really difficult without some extra
I think I'd find it pretty difficult. Like I think I would fuck off and kind of sleep on the couch a lot and maybe write and stuff, but I would do the opposite of my goal. Like I'd probably set a goal and then I'd be very productive in everything else.
Yeah. Well, that's the most common personality type is, and these are people who like keep society running, right? It's people who are good at showing up for each other, right?
Yeah. Like I heard you talk about that book on another podcast and like I already bought it today, so I'm looking forward to reading it.
Nice. Hey. Yeah, no, I think it's so, the reason I always recommend it to new managers is because the act of like putting yourself in someone else's shoes, like we tend to go, well, what would I do in this case, right? But that doesn't work, right? Like for some people on my team, they really need me to give them structure and to give them, check-ins, and that's what frees them up to do their best work. For others, it's fucking insulting, right? and you really have to know like which each person is in order to do your best for them.
Yeah. That's, I also wonder like how do you, because I know, I've read a bunch of your blog articles about specifically this, but I'm just curious to hear your own words about like what makes, like who should be a manager and who shouldn't. And then I know you talk a lot about the pendulum and like, should everyone try to be a manager at some point? Or
I think everyone who wants to should try it. I think it's very personal. Some people are very happy doing what they're doing. And I vehemently think that no one should be forced into managing or even pushed very hard, because I think that you really have to sign up for it. It's a lot of hard work. You have to want to learn a new skill set. And if you're forced into it, you're just not going to want to. Nobody wants to report to a manager who doesn't want to be there, right? Like so many people in this industry have had that experience, and it's just mind-numbingly awful. But I think that your reason for wanting to try it kind of is irrelevant. I don't think you need to be like, I really want to help people unlock their hopes and dreams. I think that just being like, I want to know what it feels like to have that power is fine. If you do responsible things with it, because generally, like once you're on the other side of this, you realize it's not everything that you thought it was, and that there are these trade-offs, and you're much more constrained than you realized, and that you're just, but sometimes, like for me, like nobody could have told me that. Like I had to experience it. And I think it's a good experience to have. I think that if you learn those skills, you will be a more powerful engineer and a better teammate, because they're really just people skills, which many of us as engineers just kind of are late to. So it's not a bad way to spend a year or two, right? It's just getting a look at the another side of the business. It will absolutely make you better at your day job, but it's not mandatory, right? You can learn other skills if you don't want to do it. But I feel like it's kind of important to demystify it, right? The more people on your team, the easiest people to manage in the world are the ones who have been managers, because they know what you're dealing with. They can help. They don't want to be in your seat. And, it's just, I love managing ex-managers. So I think that like, it's really unhealthy to be like, I can't wait to be tapped. I need to be tapped for this promotion, or, like introducing that hierarchy into it is just like deeply unhealthy in many ways. But if you just be like, just a collection of skills, and you can unbundle it, right? Like maybe there aren't any management roles available at the moment, but like, you can unbundle what a manager does and let someone like take over a couple of those responsibilities. That can be a really fun way to mix up. You can be like, I'll take on 20% of your responsibilities, and you do this for me, and then you get to own something and be accountable for it, be responsible for it, and get a taste of like running the meetings, or planning the budget, or like there's nothing that has to be done by a manager. The manager just has to make sure everything gets done. So yeah, I mean, you should at least try on some management skills. I think everyone should try that.
Even if like they're not technically a manager title, you could even just try learning that stuff from books and from trying it out, I guess.
From books, from trying it out, from being, asking if you can, for 6 months, can I run the staff meeting? Like, why the hell not? Something I don't have to do. I think running meetings is a very undervalued skill set. And it's something that I didn't have for a long time. And my life is much easier now that I know how to like command a room, drive everyone to a consensus and conclusion, corral people who are paying attention, and do it with effortlessly, right? In a way that makes people interested, leaning in and like engaged. It's a great skill set to have.
100%,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because I've noticed that like sometimes like I'll have like a meeting, and if I don't structure it properly, then the meeting just goes all over the place, or one person ends up taking over, and then you still have the same problem where it's like, okay, no, why are you having 5 people in the room if one person's talking? Exactly. Or why are you having a meeting if it's just 5 people saying everything on their mind? Because then you could just have it on Slack or something.
Exactly. It's one of those things that when it's done well, it looks effortless. It's like, it looks like it was magic and nobody did anything, right? Which is so much of management, and so much of why so many engineers like think that it's bullshit, or like it. No doubt there's bullshit involved, just like there's bullshit in being an engineer, right? But when it's done well, it makes a difference, right? Like there's a real difference being on a well-managed team and being on one that isn't run by someone who knows what they're doing.
Like, what would you say to people who feel like they're stuck on a team that isn't managed well, or like feels like, I don't know, like they don't like their...
It really depends, right? Like there's so much context involved here. What's your relationship like with your skip level? What's your relationship like with your manager? How big is the company? Is there another team that you want to work on? I think that, and then you can always leave, right? Like, God, in this job market, like any engineer can walk out the door and get another, we're all even distributed. So like that excuse is gone. I think that my main takeaway for people would be just don't be passive, right? Don't be passive, and don't let time just go by, because you only have one career. It's not even that many years long, right? And the world's moving fast. There are so many exciting, wonderful things that you could be doing or learning. Why would you put up with a job, right? Like, I think everyone deserves a job that they're engaged in, invested, where they're growing, where they're learning something. That's how you have a long and fulfilling career in this industry, not by stagnating. And I think that a lot of people, because it involves a little bit of conflict or a little bit of, facing up to things, they just let so many years just pass. And I just think that's really unfortunate. So do anything, just do something.
I like that. That's awesome. Yeah. Thank you. I really appreciate this. What would be your advice nowadays to somebody who, like, in say like 5, 10, whatever years, wants to, become a manager, or become a staff engineer, or become a CTO? Like,
well, this is all of us, right? Like nobody likes stasis. We all want, a sense of progression and development, and like your career is your single most valuable asset. It's a multi-million-dollar asset if you manage it well, right? Like, I think that, and this is not something that I was just, drifting, I was just kind of drifting. I dropped out of college. I was a music major, and I didn't want to be poor. And so I got into computers, and, I came to San Francisco, and I was 17, and I was just kind of, bouncing around doing whatever. I've never been a very strategic person when it came to my own life. And I think that's fine. I think that what kept me on a good path was just that I really lean into pain. I don't like, when I start feeling comfortable, I get really uneasy. I don't like that feeling, right? Of just like getting up every day, doing something I know how to do well. Just like, I don't do, that makes me really uncomfortable. And so I'm always kind of like leaning into the discomfort of doing something new. And I think that if you can convince yourself to enjoy discomfort in that way, it's really invaluable, because it just keeps you learning things, right? In an industry like ours, things are always changing. So you need to be constantly pushing your boundaries and trying new things. You need to feel uncomfortable when things get too comfortable. I think that, I think it goes along with the kind of careerization, the professionalization of software engineering. Like I remember the teams that I was on in the early days of my career, where we didn't do planning. We didn't do like retros. We weren't getting better. We weren't, it was very chaotic. And like the industry is getting better, in a lot of ways. And this means that a little bit of planning, I think, is really useful. If you're the type of person who likes to plan for yourself, just having like a 5-year goal or something. There's something about just looking at something and identifying to yourself, I would find that I would like to be up there giving this talk. I really admire this person. I want to be like them. That kind of orients you subconsciously in that direction and makes it more likely that you will, do that or achieve that or become that. Enjoying discomfort is also why I started public speaking, or rather, it was a little bit of fuck you. It was, I was asked to give a talk for the first time, and I was so terrified. I had nightmares about it for months beforehand, and I did terribly. I was just like, I printed out, because I was shaking too much for my computer to work, and I printed it out and I just like recited it and like turned, and there were people raising their hands and they were like, where are you going? It was so embarrassing. And I was just like, fuck, I gotta get better at this. Like I cannot be this bad at something. And so I signed up, I submitted like 20 talks, and and for the next year I spoke at a conference at least once a month. I got a prescription for propranolol, the like blood pressure medication, which is used for off-label uses for nerves, like concert pianists. One of the reasons I stopped being a music major is because of my nerves and performing. My hands would shake and be clammy. And the propranolol blocks the physical symptoms of nervousness, because the adrenal gland or adrenaline, like you'll still be nervous, but you won't have any physiological symptoms. And so
your heart won't be racing, and
your heart won't be racing,
panicking.
Exactly. So it kind of allowed me to stay calm enough in front of an audience to function. So I gave a talk a month for the next year. And after about 1.5 years of speaking at conferences, I started forgetting my prescription when I would fly out to give a talk. And that's when I was like, I guess I'm cured. But like,
that's awesome.
Learning I think that getting comfortable with speaking in public is the number one thing that I did that was good for my career. More than working at Facebook, more than being a manager. Like, I think I'm not the only one who gets a lot of nervousness, like talking to people. And it really holds you back. It really does. The ability to like form new thoughts and continue conversing. And, like I used to be one of those people that I would have to figure everything out in advance, and then I could go to the meeting, but if something changed, I couldn't like change my mind with people around. Like I would just freeze, and I'd have to go away till I could think clearly, and then I could come back. And that won't do. Like, if you want to be, any kind of leader of people, you have to be able to function while talking to them. It's kind of a very baseline thing.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that was really helpful too.
Totally. I think that's a great, it's funny because like the most like logical like conclusion of like bombing on stage or whatever would probably be to avoid it. And you pushed in the exact opposite and then like went out and did it. I like that you were honest about like, actually like, you needed, if you have anxiety or whatever, it can help to like take a medication if you need
Better
it.
living through chemistry. All about it.
Totally. Yeah. Wow. Okay. It's funny because like as you're saying that, I'm like my default whenever I'm in a meeting and I don't know what to do, or if I don't know what to say, is just like listen to everyone else and just kind of like stop. And you can even see it here. It's like, I just want to like hear what you have to say. I mean, obviously in this case, it's like a different scenario because I'm interviewing you. But I do that in like a normal conversation. I'll just be like, oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. Even if like I'm being asked a question, I'll just, so maybe that's something I'll take away from this and like try and build on.
I mean, that doesn't seem bad to me at all.
Well, that's good to know. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for doing this. Like,
yeah, absolutely.
I really appreciate this. This is really fun for me.
maybe when the world stops ending, we can be in the same town at the same time or something. Go out for drinks.
sure. Yeah.
That'd be great.
I would love that. That would be so cool. Well, I'll let you take care of the rest of your evening.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. Have a great rest of your weekend.